My mother-in-law moved into our house after I gave birth, and I found her nursing my baby in the middle of the night. The nursery door was cracked open when I woke at 2 a.m., which was wrong because I always closed it completely. My breasts ached with milk, heavy and throbbing, which meant Olivia hadn't fed in hours. I pushed off the blankets and walked down the hallway, my C-section incision pulling with each step. The nightlight cast shadows across the walls. I heard humming, soft and rhythmic, coming from inside the room. When I pushed the door open wider, I saw Diane sitting in the rocking chair with my 3-week-old daughter at her bare breast. Her nightgown was unbunched, pulled down on one side, and Olivia's tiny mouth was working against her skin. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Diane looked up at me with this serene smile, like she'd been caught doing something wonderful instead of something absolutely insane. She whispered that Olivia was hungry, and I looked so tired, so she thought she'd help. Her voice was gentle, almost loving, like she was describing making tea instead of putting my infant to her dry breast. I stood frozen in the doorway while my milk let down, warm wetness spreading across my sleep shirt. Diane kept rocking, kept humming, kept holding my baby against her chest like Olivia belonged to her. I finally found my voice and told her to give me my daughter. The words came out shaky and wrong. Diane's smile faltered for just a second before returning, brighter and more fixed. She said Olivia was perfectly content, and there was no need to wake her now. But Olivia wasn't content. She was making frustrated sounds, rooting against Diane's skin, searching for milk that wasn't there. I stepped forward and reached for my baby, and Diane finally stood up, adjusting her nightgown with one hand while holding Olivia with the other. She handed her over with this wounded expression, like I was the one being unreasonable. I took Olivia to my bedroom and locked the door, something I'd never done before in my own house. My husband David was still asleep, his back to me, breathing deep and even. I sat on the bed and lifted my shirt, and Olivia latched immediately, desperate and hungry. She fed for 40 minutes, draining both sides completely, which meant she'd been trying to nurse from Diane for God knows how long. My hands shook while I held her. I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to make it make sense, trying to find some innocent explanation, but there wasn't one. Diane had deliberately taken my newborn from her bassinet, brought her to the nursery, and attempted to breastfeed her. The violation of it made my skin crawl. When David finally woke up around 6 a.m., I told him what happened. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, looking confused. He asked if I was sure, if maybe I'd been half asleep and misunderstood. The doubt in his voice made something cold settle in my chest. I described exactly what I saw in detail that couldn't be misinterpreted. David got quiet, then said his mother had been through a lot lately, that moving in with us after her divorce was hard on her, that maybe she was just confused in the middle of the night. He suggested we not make a big deal out of it, that confronting her would only make things awkward for everyone. I stared at my husband and realized he was choosing his mother's comfort over our daughter's safety. I told him it wasn't negotiable, that Diane needed to understand boundaries, that what she did was completely unacceptable. David sighed and said he'd talk to her, but his tone suggested he thought I was overreacting. He got dressed and left the room, and I heard their voices downstairs, low and calm. No raised tones, no anger, just quiet discussion like they were planning what to make for dinner. When David came back up, he said he'd spoken to his mother and she felt terrible, that she'd just been trying to help and didn't realize it would upset me. She promised it wouldn't happen again. But Diane didn't apologize to me directly. She made breakfast that morning like nothing happened, humming the same tune I'd heard in the nursery. She set out eggs and toast and fresh coffee, playing the role of helpful grandmother, and when I came downstairs with Olivia, she smiled and asked if we'd slept well. The casual erasure of what she'd done made me feel crazy. David squeezed my shoulder as he passed, a gesture that said, "Let it go," and I felt completely alone. Over the next few days, Diane found reasons to be wherever Olivia was. When I nursed in the living room, she'd sit nearby watching with this intense focus that made my skin prickle. She'd comment on my technique, suggest I wasn't holding Olivia at the right angle, mention that babies could sense when their mother was tense. She'd reach over and adjust Olivia's position while she was latched, her hands on my breast, my baby, my body, like she had every right. I started nursing in my bedroom with the door locked, but that created its own problems because Diane would knock and ask if everything was okay, if I needed help, if Olivia was feeding properly. She started keeping a log. I found it on the kitchen counter one morning, a spiral notebook with dates, times, and durations of every feeding. Diane had been tracking how long Olivia nursed, which breast, how many wet diapers she had throughout the day. When I asked about it, she said she was just trying to be helpful, that first-time mothers sometimes miss important patterns. She pointed out that Olivia had only nursed for 15 minutes at 3 a.m., which was shorter than usual, which might indicate a problem with my supply. The implication was clear. I wasn't producing enough milk. My baby was still hungry. Diane had been researching infant nutrition and thought we should consider supplementing with formula. She'd already bought some, just in case, and had bottles ready to go. I told her absolutely not, that my pediatrician said Olivia was gaining weight perfectly, that my supply was fine. Diane smiled that patient smile and said, of course, whatever I thought was best. But if I changed my mind, she'd left the formula in the pantry. David worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital. which meant I was alone with Diane most days. She'd taken over the house in small ways that added up to complete control. She reorganized the kitchen so I couldn't find anything. She did all the laundry, including Olivia's clothes, which meant I had to ask her where things were. She started answering the door when friends came to visit, greeting them with this warm hostess energy, making it seem like this was her house and I was the guest. She'd bring tea and cookies, settle into conversations, and somehow I'd end up feeling like the outsider in my own living room. My friend Rebecca came by one afternoon with a meal she'd made, and Diane thanked her profusely, took the dish, and mentioned how exhausted I'd been, how worried she was about postpartum depression, how glad she was to be there to help. Rebecca gave me this concerned look and asked privately if I was okay. I wanted to scream that I was fine until Diane moved in, but I just nodded and said I was adjusting. The night I found Diane in the nursery again, I'd been asleep for maybe an hour. I woke to that same feeling of wrongness, that awareness that something wasn't right. I got up and walked to Olivia's room, and this time I opened the door silently. Diane was sitting in the rocking chair with my daughter, but this time she had a bottle. She was feeding Olivia formula in the dark, and my baby was taking it, her little hands pressed against the bottle. Diane looked up when she sensed me there, and her expression wasn't guilty or surprised. It was triumphant. She whispered that Olivia was still hungry after I'd put her down, that she'd been fussing, that the formula was helping her settle. I walked over and took the bottle from her hands, took my daughter from her arms, and told her to get out. My voice was shaking but clear. Diane stood up slowly, adjusting her robe, and said I was being irrational, that she was only trying to help, that sleep deprivation was clearly affecting my judgment. She suggested I talk to a doctor about my anxiety levels. I took Olivia to my bedroom and woke David up by turning on all the lights. I told him what just happened, showed him the bottle still half full of formula, explained that his mother had gone behind my back after I'd explicitly said no supplementing. David sat up looking exhausted and frustrated, and he said maybe one bottle wasn't the end of the world, that his mother was just trying to let me sleep. I asked him if he understood that Diane was undermining my decisions about our daughter, that she was feeding our baby without my consent, that this was a pattern of behavior that kept escalating. David ran his hands through his hair and said I was making this into something bigger than it needed to be, that his mother was grieving her marriage and needed to feel useful, that maybe I was being too rigid about the breastfeeding thing. Like my choice to nurse my own child was some kind of quirky preference instead of a fundamental right. I told David he had until morning to decide whether his wife and daughter mattered more than his mother's feelings. Then I turned off the light and fed Olivia while he lay there in silence. When morning came, David tried to smooth things over without actually addressing anything. He suggested we all sit down and have a calm conversation, set some clear boundaries that everyone could agree on. He made it sound so reasonable, so mature, like this was a simple miscommunication instead of repeated violations. We gathered in the living room after breakfast. Diane sat on the couch looking small and sad, her eyes red like she'd been crying. David started by saying we all wanted what was best for Olivia, and that meant working together as a family. He asked me to explain my concerns, and I did. I listed every incident calmly and clearly. The attempted breastfeeding, the feeding log, the formula in the pantry, the bottle feeding in the middle of the night. Diane listened with her head bowed, twisting a tissue in her hands. When I finished, she looked up at David, not at me, and said she never meant to overstep, that she was just so excited to be a grandmother, that after her divorce she'd felt so lost and empty, and helping with Olivia gave her purpose. Her voice broke on the word purpose, and I watched David's expression soften. He reached over and squeezed his mother's hand, then turned to me and said, we could all try harder to communicate better. I asked him point blank if he was going to tell his mother that she couldn't take Olivia from her bassinet without asking, couldn't feed her bottles without permission, couldn't attempt to nurse her. David's jaw tightened, and he said those things were understood, that his mother knew better now, that we didn't need to spell out every single rule like she was a child. Diane nodded eagerly and promised she'd check with me before doing anything with Olivia, that she'd respect my wishes completely. Her eyes were still on David when she said it. Over the next week, Diane was the picture of compliance. She asked permission for everything in this exaggerated, almost mocking way. Could she hold Olivia? Could she change her diaper? Could she sit in the room while I nursed? Each question felt like a small punishment, a reminder that I was the unreasonable one making everyone walk on eggshells. David seemed relieved that things were calm, but I felt the tension coiling tighter. Diane was performing compliance while radiating resentment. I started noticing Olivia was fussier than usual, especially in the evenings. She'd nurse and seem satisfied. Then 20 minutes later, she'd be rooting and crying again like she was starving. My pediatrician said growth spurts were normal, that I should just feed on demand, that my supply would adjust. But something felt off. Olivia would latch and then pull away frustrated. Latch and pull away, like the milk wasn't coming fast enough or there wasn't enough there. I started pumping between feedings to check my output, and the amount seemed fine, but Olivia's behavior didn't match. One afternoon I pumped right after nursing her just to see, and barely got an ounce total from both breasts. That should have been impossible. I'd just fed her 30 minutes earlier. My breasts should have been full. I sat there staring at the bottles with their pathetic amounts of milk, and a horrible thought crept into my mind. I went downstairs and found Diane in the kitchen preparing dinner. I asked her directly if she'd been pumping my breast milk. She looked genuinely confused, asked why on earth she would do that, and I felt stupid for even suggesting it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Diane's obsession with my milk supply, her comments about supplementing, her insistence that Olivia wasn't getting enough. I thought about the breast pump that lived in the nursery, plugged in and ready to use. I thought about the hours Diane spent alone in the house while I tried to nap, while David was at work, while I was in the shower. At 4 a.m., I got up and went to the nursery. I checked the pump and noticed the bottles attached to it were slightly damp inside, even though I'd washed and dried them that morning. I opened the small fridge we kept in there for storing milk, the one I'd thought was empty because I'd been feeding directly instead of pumping. Inside were 4 bottles, each containing about 3 ounces of breast milk. I'd assumed Diane was just keeping the fridge running in case I needed it. Now I wondered if she'd been pumping my milk and storing it, waiting for the right moment to use it. I took one of the bottles and went back to my bedroom. When I held it up to the light, the milk looked slightly off, thinner than usual, almost watery. The next morning, I took a bottle to my lactation consultant without telling anyone where I was going. She ran a test to check the fat content and nutrient levels, and her expression changed as she looked at the results. She said this milk had been diluted, probably with water, maybe 50-50 based on the composition. Someone had taken breast milk and cut it with water, reducing its nutritional value to almost nothing. She asked if I'd been freezing and thawing milk improperly, and I said no, that someone else had access to my pump and my milk storage. Her face went still, and she asked if I was safe at home. That question landed like a punch. I told her about Diane, about finding her nursing Olivia, about the formula, about everything. The lactation consultant documented what I said and gave me the test results in writing. She told me to trust my instincts, that what I was describing was a pattern of sabotage, that some women become psychologically attached to infants in unhealthy ways, especially after trauma like divorce. She used the word obsession, and it fit perfectly. I went home and found Diane holding Olivia in the living room, swaying and singing to her. My daughter was crying, that frustrated, hungry cry I'd been hearing more and more. Diane looked up and said Olivia had been fussy all morning, that she'd tried everything to soothe her. I took my daughter and lifted my shirt to nurse her, and Diane watched with that intense focus again. Olivia latched frantically, nursing hard and fast, and I felt my milk let down strong and full, which meant my supply was fine, which meant something else was making her seem hungry all the time. I looked at Diane and asked her again if she'd been using my breast pump. She said no, of course not, but her eyes shifted slightly to the left. I told her I had the diluted milk tested, that I knew someone had been adding water to it, that there was documentation now. Diane's face went carefully blank. She said she had no idea what I was talking about, that if something was wrong with the milk, it must have been a problem with the pump or the storage, that she would never do anything to harm her granddaughter. David came home to me crying in our bedroom with Olivia, and Diane downstairs acting confused and hurt. He listened to both sides, looked at the test results, and said there had to be some other explanation. Maybe I'd accidentally grabbed the wrong bottles. Maybe the pump had malfunctioned. Maybe the lactation consultant was wrong. He couldn't believe his mother would deliberately sabotage breast milk. When I asked him why she'd been pumping at all when I never gave her permission, he didn't have an answer. He just kept saying we needed to remain calm, that accusations would only make things worse, that his mother was fragile right now and needed support. I asked him when he was going to support his wife and daughter, and he looked at me like I'd slapped him. He said he was supporting us, that he was trying to keep the peace, that I was being unreasonable expecting him to choose sides. But that was exactly what I expected. I expected him to choose his wife and infant daughter over his mother, who was demonstrating increasingly disturbed behavior. The fact that he saw that as an impossible choice told me everything I needed to know. That night, I moved the breast pump into my bedroom and told Diane she was no longer allowed in the nursery when I wasn't there. She protested to David, said I was being paranoid and controlling, that she felt like a prisoner in her own son's home. David asked if I could just give his mother the benefit of the doubt, and I said no. I was done giving benefit of the doubt. I was done pretending this was normal. I was done sacrificing my comfort and my daughter's well-being to protect Diane's feelings. David slept on the couch that night, and I heard him and Diane talking in low voices until late. The next morning, he was cold and distant, making coffee without speaking, leaving for work without kissing me goodbye. Diane stayed in her room until he left, then came downstairs dressed and composed. She told me she'd decided to give me space, that clearly her presence was causing stress, that she'd stay with her sister for a few weeks until things calmed down. Her tone was martyr-like, as if she was being forced out instead of choosing to leave after being caught sabotaging breast milk. I told her that sounded like a good plan. She packed slowly, making a show of being hurt, and David came home early to help her load her car. He hugged her goodbye and told her he'd call every day. Then he came inside and asked if I was happy now. The question was so loaded, so bitter, that I didn't answer it. I just went upstairs with Olivia and locked the door again. For 3 days, David barely spoke to me. He worked, came home, ate dinner in front of the TV, and went to bed without conversation. He called his mother every night and talked in that soothing voice he used to use with me. I felt my marriage cracking apart in real time. On the fourth day, I woke up at 1 a.m. and David wasn't in bed. I heard water running downstairs and found him in the kitchen, standing at the sink with his head bowed. When he turned around, his eyes were red. He said he couldn't do this anymore, that he felt torn apart, that he didn't know how to make both of us happy. I told him he shouldn't be trying to make us both happy. He should be protecting his daughter. David's face twisted, and he said I was forcing him to abandon his mother when she needed him most, that I was being cruel and unforgiving, that marriage was supposed to be about compromise. I asked him what I was supposed to compromise on. My breast milk? My baby's safety? My right to parent my own child? He didn't answer. Instead, he said his mother had been seeing a therapist since the divorce, that she'd been diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, that she was struggling with empty nest syndrome now that he was gone and her marriage was over. He said she'd lost her identity and was trying to find purpose by helping with Olivia. He made it sound so sympathetic, so understandable, but I heard what he wasn't saying. That his mother's mental health was my responsibility to manage, that I should accept inappropriate behavior because she was suffering. I told David that I felt sorry for what Diane was going through, but that didn't give her the right to violate boundaries with our daughter, that mental illness wasn't an excuse for the things she'd done. David said I was being cold, that I lacked compassion, that his mother had always been there for him, and now he needed to be there for her. The unspoken accusation hung between us. I was making him choose, and that made me the villain. I went back to bed alone and listened to him pace the kitchen until dawn. When he finally came up, he got in the shower without speaking. I fed Olivia and decided I was done waiting for David to see reason. I called my own mother that afternoon and explained everything. She listened without interrupting, which made me cry because it had been so long since someone just listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said she was coming to stay with me. She lived 8 hours away, but she'd leave that evening and be there by midnight. I told her she didn't have to, but she said yes she did, that David was failing me and I needed support. She arrived just after midnight like she promised, took one look at me and pulled me into a hug. Having her there changed everything. My mother understood boundaries. She watched Olivia while I showered, but she handed her back the moment I returned. She helped with laundry and cooking, but she asked before touching anything. She listened when I vented about David and Diane without making excuses for them. Most importantly, she witnessed everything that happened next, so I knew I wasn't crazy. David wasn't pleased when he came home from work and found my mother installed in the guest room. He was polite but cool, and I could tell he felt ambushed. My mother smiled and said she was just here to help her daughter, the same way Diane had been trying to help. The comparison was deliberate, and David's jaw tightened. That evening, Diane called, and David put her on speaker like I wasn't sitting right there. She asked how everyone was doing, specifically asked about Olivia, and said she'd been missing her so much. David told her Olivia was fine, that I'd been managing okay. Diane asked if she could come visit the next day just for an hour, just to see her granddaughter. David looked at me and I shook my head. He told his mother maybe it was still too soon, and Diane's voice changed. She said she'd been giving me space like I wanted, that she'd apologized, that she didn't understand what more she was supposed to do. She started crying, saying she felt like she'd lost her son and her granddaughter, that the divorce had already taken everything, and now I was taking her family too. David's resolve crumbled. He said of course she could visit, that tomorrow would be fine. I stood up and left the room. My mother followed me upstairs and told me I had every right to say no, that this was my home and my baby. I said David would never forgive me if I kept refusing. My mother said maybe I needed to stop worrying about what David would forgive. Diane arrived the next afternoon carrying gifts. A huge teddy bear for Olivia, flowers for me, expensive coffee for David. She hugged everyone except me, greeting my mother with exaggerated warmth like they were old friends. My mother was polite but distant, watching everything with sharp eyes. Diane asked to hold Olivia, and I said she could hold her in the living room where I could see. Diane's smile tightened, but she agreed. She sat on the couch with my daughter, cooing and taking photos on her phone. She asked if she could feed Olivia a bottle, and I said no, that it wasn't feeding time. Diane laughed like I'd made a joke and said babies eat when they're hungry, that schedules were too rigid. I repeated that it wasn't feeding time. Diane looked at David and he jumped in saying maybe we could be a little flexible. I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder, steadying me. I told Diane she could hold Olivia for 20 more minutes, then she needed to leave. Diane's face went cold. She asked if I was seriously going to time her visit like a prison sentence if I really hated her that much. I didn't answer. I just sat there while she held my baby and pretended everything was fine. The 20 minutes crawled by. Diane kept up a constant stream of chatter, telling Olivia how much she loved her, how she'd always be there for her, how Grandma would protect her no matter what. The subtext was clear. She was positioning herself as Olivia's protector from her unreasonable mother. When time was up, I stood and held out my arms. Diane held Olivia tighter and asked for just 5 more minutes. I said no. Diane looked at David again, and this time he stayed silent, torn between us. My mother stepped forward and said very calmly that the visit was over, that Diane should hand over the baby now. Diane's expression went ugly for just a second before smoothing back into hurt confusion. She stood up slowly and handed Olivia to me, then gathered her purse and jacket. She told David she'd call him later, kissed his cheek, and left without acknowledging me or my mother. The door closed and the tension deflated. David immediately said I'd been unnecessarily harsh, that his mother was trying, that I could have given her 5 more minutes. My mother turned to him and said his wife had set a boundary and he'd undermined her in front of his mother, that he was teaching Diane that if she pushed hard enough, she could get what she wanted. David's face flushed red. He told my mother respectfully that this was between him and his wife, that outside input wasn't helpful. My mother smiled tightly and said she'd be in the kitchen if I needed her. After she left, David and I had the fight we'd been avoiding. He said I was being controlling and paranoid, that I'd taken a few strange incidents and blown them into some conspiracy, that his mother was just an overeager grandmother. I asked him if he truly believed that finding her with our baby at her breast was just overeager. He faltered, then said she'd explained that she was half asleep and confused. I asked about the diluted breast milk. He said the test could have been wrong, that I'd probably just stored it improperly. Every excuse, every justification, every way to avoid admitting that his mother's behavior was deeply wrong. I told David I needed him to choose right now. Either Diane followed strict boundaries that I enforced, or she didn't have contact with Olivia until I felt safe. David asked what gave me the right to make that decision alone. I told him I was Olivia's mother and my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. He said my instincts were being influenced by postpartum hormones and stress. The dismissiveness of that statement made me want to scream. I picked up my phone and called my lactation consultant on speaker. When she answered, I asked her to explain to my husband what she'd told me about the test results and her concerns. She repeated everything clearly and professionally, adding that what I'd described was consistent with a grandmother experiencing what's called phantom lactation, or pseudocyesis-related behaviors, where a woman's desire to nurse an infant manifests in inappropriate ways. She'd seen it before in cases of severe mental health issues or boundary violations. She recommended Diane see a psychiatrist before having unsupervised access to the baby. David listened with a stone face. When the call ended, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd talked to his mother about seeing someone, but he couldn't cut her off completely. I told him I wasn't asking him to cut her off. I was asking him to prioritize our daughter's safety. He nodded slowly, but I could see the resentment building in his eyes. He blamed me for making this hard. Over the next 2 weeks, things were tense but manageable. David talked to Diane about therapy, and she agreed to see someone, though she framed it as doing me a favor since I was so anxious. My mother stayed and helped create a routine that felt stable and safe. Olivia thrived. She was nursing well, sleeping better, less fussy overall. The change was noticeable. Then David came home one evening and said his mother's therapist wanted to meet with all of us for a family session. He said it would be helpful for everyone to air grievances in a mediated space, to work toward healing. Something about it felt wrong, but I agreed because I wanted David to see that I was willing to try. We scheduled the session for the following week. My mother offered to watch Olivia, and we drove to the therapist's office in silence. The office was decorated in soothing blues and grays, with tissue boxes strategically placed and inspirational posters on the walls. Diane was already there, sitting next to a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Vivian Reeves. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice, and she started by thanking us for coming. She said family therapy could be challenging but rewarding, that her goal was to help us communicate more effectively. She asked each of us to share our perspective, starting with Diane. Diane talked for 15 minutes about how much she loved being a grandmother, how the divorce had devastated her, how she'd tried to be helpful but felt rejected and punished. She cried talking about losing access to Olivia, about feeling like I hated her for no reason. She made herself sound like a victim of my cruelty. When it was my turn, I laid out everything factually. The nursing incident, the feeding log, the diluted milk, the boundary violations. I kept my tone calm and stuck to observable facts. Dr. Reeves listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she asked Diane to respond. Diane said she remembered things differently, that she'd never tried to nurse Olivia, but had been holding her near her chest when I came in, and misinterpreted in my exhausted state. She said she'd never diluted milk, that I must have made an error or the test was wrong. She reframed every incident as either a misunderstanding or my overreaction. Dr. Reeves turned to David and asked what he'd witnessed. David said he hadn't seen most of it directly, that he'd been at work, but that he believed both of us were telling our truth. The diplomatic answer that meant nothing. Dr. Reeves suggested that we were experiencing a clash of attachment styles, that Diane's desire to bond with her granddaughter was triggering my protective instincts, that both were valid but needed to find balance. She recommended scheduled visits with clear expectations, maybe starting with 1 hour a week in our home, building trust gradually. It sounded reasonable, but something felt wrong about how she'd both sided the situation, treating boundary violations and protective parenting as equally problematic. I asked Dr. Reeves if she thought attempting to breastfeed someone else's baby was a clash of attachment styles. She said in her professional opinion, sleep deprivation and stress could cause people to misperceive situations, that Diane's explanation of holding the baby near her chest seemed plausible. I felt like I'd been punched. This therapist was telling me I'd imagined what I'd seen. I looked at David, hoping he'd defend me, but he was nodding along like this made sense. Diane looked satisfied, vindicated. I stood up and said I needed air. I walked out of the office into the parking lot, shaking with anger and disbelief. My mother had been right. I was on my own. David came out 10 minutes later and said I'd embarrassed him by walking out. I asked him if he'd heard how that therapist gaslit me, how she dismissed everything I said. David said Dr. Reeves was a professional, that maybe I needed to consider I might be wrong about some of this. The betrayal was complete. My husband believed his mother's therapist over his wife. We drove home in hostile silence. When we got there, my mother took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her everything, and she got very quiet. Then she said she'd been doing some research while we were gone, looking into grandparents' rights and parental authority. She'd found some disturbing information. In our state, grandparents could petition for visitation rights if they could prove a substantial relationship with the child, and that denial of access would harm the child. She'd also found that some lawyers specialized in helping grandparents win custody or partial custody in cases where they could demonstrate the parents were unfit. I felt cold wash over me. I asked why she was telling me this. My mother said because Diane was building a case. The therapy session, the documentation of my anxiety, the framing of me as unstable, it all fit a pattern. If Diane wanted access to Olivia and I kept refusing, she could potentially take us to court. And with David on her side, claiming I was being unreasonable and paranoid, a judge might rule in her favor. The thought made me physically ill. I'd been worried about boundaries and safety, not realizing Diane might be planning something much bigger. I confronted David that night after my mother went to bed. I asked him directly if he'd discussed grandparents' rights with his mother. He looked shocked, said of course not, that I was really losing it now. But his reaction felt too big, too defensive. I pressed, asking if Diane had ever mentioned wanting formal visitation or custody arrangements. David said she'd mentioned feeling powerless, that she'd asked if there was any legal recourse for grandparents who were being alienated. He'd told her he didn't think it would come to that we'd work it out as a family. My stomach dropped. He'd known she was thinking about legal action and hadn't told me. I asked him when he was planning to mention that his mother was considering suing us for access to our daughter. David said it wasn't like that she was just upset and asking questions. I told him it was exactly like that. Diane was building a case with her therapist's help, documenting my issues, creating a narrative where I was the problem and she was the concerned grandmother. David called me paranoid again, and I told him to get out of our bedroom. He left, and I heard him on the phone immediately, probably calling his mother. The next morning, I contacted a family law attorney named Greta Winters. I explained the situation in detail, including the therapy session and my mother's concerns about grandparents' rights. Greta listened carefully and told me I was right to be worried. She said what I'd described sounded like a textbook case of a grandparent establishing grounds for a legal petition. The therapy documentation would be particularly damaging because it created an official record of conflict and my supposed mental health issues. She asked if I had any documentation of Diane's behavior. I mentioned the diluted milk test, the lactation consultant's notes, and my own written timeline of incidents. Greta said that was good, but I needed more, preferably video or audio evidence, witness statements from people who'd seen Diane's behavior. She recommended I start documenting everything, that I prepare for the possibility of a custody fight. The consultation cost $300 I didn't have, but my mother paid it without hesitation. She told me this was war now, and we needed to be ready. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Diane. Dates, times, what was said, who witnessed it. I told my friends what was happening and asked them to write statements about what they'd observed. Rebecca wrote 3 pages about the day she'd visited and Diane's comments about my mental health. Another friend described how Diane had answered my door like she owned the place. I gathered everything and gave it to Greta, who filed it carefully in a folder labeled with Olivia's name. She told me that if Diane filed a petition, we'd be ready to counter with evidence of her inappropriate behavior. But she also warned me that family court could be unpredictable, that judges sometimes sided with grandparents if they seemed sincere, and the parents seemed difficult. The word difficult hit me hard. That's exactly what Diane was making me look like. Difficult, paranoid, unreasonable. Meanwhile, she was the loving grandmother being cruelly kept from her grandchild. 2 weeks later, David came home from dinner with his mother and said she'd asked him to talk to me about mediation. She wanted to work out a formal visitation schedule with a neutral third party, something that would give everyone peace of mind and clear expectations. David thought it sounded like a good compromise. I saw it for what it was. Diane wanted court-sanctioned access before filing a formal petition, establishing a legal relationship with Olivia that would be harder to terminate later. I told David absolutely not, that agreeing to mediation would be admitting there was a legitimate dispute over Diane's rights to our child. He said I was overthinking it, that it was just about reducing conflict. I showed him the notes from my consultation with Greta, explained how mediation could be used against us. David read the notes slowly, and his face changed. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He asked if I really thought his mother would sue us. I said yes. I thought that's exactly where this was heading. David sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. He said his mother had been through so much that she just wanted to be part of Olivia's life, that maybe I could try harder to make that work. I told him I'd been trying. What I couldn't do was expose our daughter to someone who'd violated basic boundaries repeatedly and was now building a legal case against us. David looked up at me with exhausted, conflicted eyes, and I saw our marriage dying in real time. He couldn't choose between us, which meant he'd already chosen not to choose me. I told him I needed him to move out for a while, that I couldn't live with someone who wouldn't protect our daughter. David's face went white. He asked if I was seriously doing this, throwing away our marriage over his mother. I said no. He'd thrown away our marriage by refusing to set boundaries with his mother. He'd chosen her feelings over our family's safety over and over, and I was done waiting for him to see what that cost. David packed a bag that night. He was crying when he kissed Olivia goodbye. He didn't kiss me. He just looked at me like I'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. Then he left. I locked the door behind him and stood in the quiet house with my mother and my daughter, and I felt relief mixed with grief. The next day, David's lawyer sent me paperwork. He was filing for separation and requesting joint custody with a formal parenting plan. The papers outlined a schedule where Olivia would spend 3 days with me and 4 days with him, alternating weeks. There was a clause about grandparent access, specifying that Diane would have supervised visits during David's custody time. I read it twice, unable to believe he'd done this. He'd weaponized custody to force Diane into our daughter's life. I called Greta immediately, and she filed an emergency response. We requested primary physical custody with supervised visitation for David until his housing situation was stable, no third-party contact during his visits, and a psychological evaluation for Diane before any grandparent access was considered. Greta said the mention of grandparent rights in David's filing was actually helpful to us because it showed his priorities. We had a hearing scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, David could have supervised visits at my discretion. I told him he could come to the house to see Olivia, but Diane wasn't welcome. He came twice that first week, staying for an hour each time, holding Olivia stiffly while my mother watched from the kitchen. He barely spoke to me. The hearing was in family court, a depressing beige room with uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lights. David sat on one side with his lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Kimberly Ortiz. I sat on the other side with Greta. The judge was an older man with reading glasses, Judge Philip Harmon, who looked tired before we even started. Both lawyers presented their cases. Kimberly talked about how I'd suddenly kicked David out of his own home, how I was alienating him from his daughter, how my behavior had become increasingly erratic since the birth. She referenced Dr. Reeves's notes from the therapy session, pointing out documented concerns about my mental state. She said David just wanted a fair custody arrangement and the opportunity for his mother, Olivia's grandmother, to be part of her life. Greta countered with our evidence, the lactation consultant's report about diluted milk, the written statements from friends describing Diane's boundary violations, my detailed timeline of incidents. She argued that I'd been protecting my infant from someone displaying disturbing behavior, that David had failed to support appropriate boundaries, and that his filing was an attempt to circumvent my parental authority by establishing grandparent rights through his custody time. Judge Harmon listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and asked me directly why I felt Diane was a danger to my daughter. I explained about finding her attempting to nurse Olivia, about the sabotaged breast milk, about the pattern of violations. The judge asked if I'd filed a police report about the milk tampering. I said no, that I'd been trying to handle it within the family. He asked if I'd sought a restraining order. I said no, for the same reason. Judge Harmon said he understood my concerns, but that without formal legal action, it was hard to substantiate claims of danger. He noted that Diane had no criminal record, that she was seeing a therapist, that her behavior could be interpreted as overly helpful rather than malicious. He ordered a custody evaluation, appointing a psychologist to interview both parents and make recommendations. In the meantime, he established a temporary schedule. Olivia would remain primarily with me, but David would have unsupervised visits at his new apartment 3 times a week for 4 hours each. No third parties during visits, which meant Diane was excluded for now. Both lawyers seemed moderately satisfied, which meant we'd both lost something. As we left the courthouse, Kimberly cornered me in the hallway and said her client was willing to negotiate if I'd be reasonable about his mother. I told her there was nothing to negotiate. She smiled coldly and said we'd see what the evaluator found. The custody evaluator was Dr. Nathan Pierce, a psychologist who specialized in high-conflict family cases. He scheduled separate interviews with me and David, then requested a joint session, then wanted to observe each of us with Olivia. My interview lasted 3 hours. Dr. Pierce asked detailed questions about my pregnancy, delivery, postpartum period, relationship with David, and concerns about Diane. I answered everything honestly, walking him through each incident chronologically. He took extensive notes and asked probing questions about my mental health history, whether I'd experienced depression or anxiety before the pregnancy, whether I was currently in therapy. I explained I'd started seeing a counselor after David moved out, that I was processing the betrayal and stress. Dr. Pierce asked if I was on medication. I said no. He asked if I'd considered it. I said my therapist hadn't recommended it. He wrote something down that felt ominous. When it was David's turn, he apparently painted a picture of a woman who'd become increasingly paranoid and controlling after giving birth, who'd pushed him out of his own home, who was alienating his mother over misunderstandings. Dr. Pierce told me this in our joint session, asking me to respond. I pulled out my documentation, showed him the timeline, the test results, the witness statements. David's face flushed red as he listened. He said I was obsessed with proving his mother was evil, that I'd twisted innocent incidents into evidence of conspiracy. Dr. Pierce asked him to explain the diluted milk. David said the test could have been wrong or I'd made a mistake storing it. The evaluator asked if he'd witnessed any of the incidents I described. David admitted he'd been at work for most of them. Dr. Pierce made more notes, his expression neutral. The observation sessions were worse. Dr. Pierce came to my house to watch me interact with Olivia. I fed her, changed her, played with her, narrated what I was doing like I was performing motherhood. Dr. Pierce asked questions about my routines, my support system, how I was managing alone. I mentioned my mother's help, and he asked how much involvement she had in daily care. I explained she helped with household tasks, but I did all of Olivia's care myself. He asked if I was isolating myself from friends. I said no, that friends visited regularly, but that I was cautious about who had access to my daughter given recent events. He wrote that down. When he observed David, it was at David's apartment. I wasn't present, but David told me later that his mother had shown up halfway through. She'd claimed she was just stopping by to drop off dinner, but Dr. Pierce had documented the visit. David said he'd told his mother to leave, that she'd cried and apologized, that Dr. Pierce had witnessed the whole thing. I didn't know if that would help or hurt us. 2 weeks later, Dr. Pierce submitted his report to the court. Greta called me the moment she received a copy. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. The report recommended shared physical custody with a week-on, week-off schedule. Dr. Pierce had concluded that both parents were competent and loving, that my concerns about Diane appeared exaggerated due to postpartum stress, that David's mother had legitimate grandparent interests, and that supervised visits between Diane and Olivia should be facilitated during David's custody time to reduce family conflict. He'd pathologized my protective instincts and validated every argument David's lawyer had made. Greta explained that evaluator reports carried significant weight with judges, that Judge Harmon would likely adopt the recommendations unless we could present compelling new evidence. She asked if there was anything else, any incidents I hadn't mentioned, anything we could use. I felt helpless. Everything I had, I'd already shown. Diane had been careful since David moved out, keeping her distance, playing the victim perfectly. Meanwhile, my marriage was destroyed. I was facing shared custody, and Diane was going to get court-sanctioned access to my daughter. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, and I heard a sound from Olivia's room. My heart seized. I got up and walked to the nursery, opened the door slowly, and saw nothing wrong. Olivia was asleep in her crib, peaceful and safe, but the window was open. I always kept that window locked. I walked over and looked outside, saw nothing but darkness and the empty street below, but someone had opened it. The lock was undone from the inside, which meant someone had been in the house. I checked every room, every window, every door. Everything else was locked. Only the nursery window had been opened. I called the police, and 2 officers came out to take a report. They checked for signs of forced entry, found none, and suggested maybe I'd opened the window earlier and forgotten. I insisted I hadn't. They took notes, but clearly didn't believe someone had broken in without stealing anything or leaving evidence. After they left, my mother helped me install a camera in the nursery, one of those baby monitors with motion detection and cloud recording. We set it to alert my phone if it detected movement. Then we made sure every window and door in the house had additional locks or security bars. I felt like I was in a prison, and in a way I was, trapped by Diane's manipulation, by the legal system's dismissal of my concerns, by my husband's betrayal. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from the nursery camera. Movement detected. I pulled up the app and watched live footage of the nursery. The door was opening slowly. A figure moved into frame, walking toward Olivia's crib. My heart stopped. Then the figure turned toward the camera, and I saw Diane's face clearly in the nightlight's glow. She was in my house, in my daughter's nursery, bending over the crib. I screamed for my mother and called 911, and we both ran to the nursery. By the time we got there, Diane was lifting Olivia out of the crib. My mother hit the lights, and Diane froze, holding my crying baby against her chest. Her expression was blank, almost peaceful, like she was exactly where she belonged. The police arrived within minutes. I showed them the video footage on my phone, showing Diane entering the nursery. They asked her how she'd gotten inside, and she said David had given her a key months ago when she first moved in, that she still had it, that she was just checking on her granddaughter. The officers looked at each other, clearly uncertain about how to handle a grandmother with a key checking on a baby. I told them I'd asked for all keys back when Diane moved out, that she'd never returned this one, that she'd broken into my home in the middle of the night without permission. One officer asked Diane if she'd told anyone she was coming. She said no, that she'd been worried about Olivia and had wanted to make sure she was okay. The officer asked why she was worried. Diane's eyes filled with tears, and she said she'd had a feeling something was wrong, a grandmother's intuition. She was still holding Olivia, who had stopped crying and was looking around confused. I stepped forward and held out my arms for my daughter. Diane held her tighter, and one of the officers gently told her to hand over the baby. Diane reluctantly gave Olivia to me, and I backed away, putting distance between us. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges for trespassing. I said yes, absolutely. They arrested Diane there in the nursery, handcuffing her while she cried about just wanting to see her grandbaby. My mother stood beside me with her arm around my shoulders while they led Diane out. After they left, I sat in the rocking chair with Olivia and shook for an hour. My mother called Greta, who said this changed everything. Breaking into my home, especially after the custody dispute had started, demonstrated exactly the kind of boundary violation I'd been describing. She'd file an emergency motion first thing in the morning. The video footage was gold. The police report was gold. Finally, Diane had given us undeniable evidence. But I felt no satisfaction, just this bone-deep exhaustion and fear, because Diane had been in my house, in my daughter's room, and I hadn't known until she was already there. What if I hadn't installed the camera? What if I hadn't woken up? What would Diane have done? David called at 7 a.m., woken by a call from his mother's lawyer about her arrest. He was furious, saying I'd had his mother arrested for being concerned about her grandchild, that I'd taken things too far now. I told him to watch the video I was sending him, then hung up. I forwarded the nursery footage, and he didn't call back for 3 hours. When he finally did, his voice was different, smaller. He said he'd watched it 5 times, that he couldn't understand why his mother would do that he'd thought I was exaggerating, but now he saw. The break in his voice made me want to cry, but I had nothing left for him. I told him his mother needed serious psychological help, that she'd been escalating this entire time while he'd defended her, that our daughter could have been seriously harmed. David said he knew, that he was sorry, that he'd been wrong. The apology came too late. We had an emergency hearing 2 days later. Judge Harmon looked at the video footage, read the police report, and his expression hardened. He asked Diane's lawyer if her client had an explanation for breaking into my home at 2 a.m. to remove an infant from her crib. The lawyer stammered something about concern and poor judgment. The judge said it looked like criminal behavior to him. He revoked David's pending custody petition, ordered a psychological evaluation for Diane before she could have any contact with Olivia, issued a restraining order requiring her to stay 500 feet from me and my daughter, and ordered David to return all keys to my residence immediately. He also recommended criminal prosecution for the break-in. Kimberly tried to salvage something, arguing that David shouldn't be punished for his mother's actions, but Judge Harmon shut her down. He said David's judgment was seriously in question given his continued defense of someone who'd just committed a crime to access an infant. He ordered supervised visitation only until David completed parenting classes focused on boundaries and safety. The hearing ended, and Diane was escorted out by court security because she'd tried to approach me in the hallway. She'd screamed that I was keeping her from her baby, that Olivia needed her, that I was a terrible mother. Multiple people heard it, including the judge's clerk. It was the final nail in her case. The prosecutor's office filed charges: breaking and entering, attempted custodial interference, and stalking based on the pattern of behavior I'd documented. Diane was looking at real criminal penalties. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal: probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting contact with me or Olivia. Diane would have to complete a psychological evaluation and treatment program before the restraining order could ever be reconsidered. And even then, it would be my choice whether to allow contact. The plea was accepted, and Diane's relationship with her granddaughter ended in a courtroom with a judge's gavel. David called me that night. He said he'd been completely wrong about everything, that he'd failed me and Olivia, that his mother was sicker than he'd realized. He asked if there was any way to fix our marriage. I told him I didn't know, that I couldn't think about that while I was still processing everything that happened. He said he understood, that he'd give me space, but that he wanted to try if I'd let him. I said maybe someday, but not now. I needed time to remember who I was without constantly fighting to protect my daughter from the people who should have been helping me protect her. A year later, Diane completed her court-mandated treatment and petitioned to have supervised visits with Olivia. The psychologist's report said she'd made progress, but still struggled with boundary issues and had obsessive tendencies regarding infants. I declined to allow contact, and the judge upheld my decision, saying Olivia's safety was paramount. David completed his classes in therapy, proved he could maintain boundaries, and we established a careful custody schedule. He sees Olivia regularly now, and he's a good father when his mother isn't involved. We're not back together, maybe we never will be, but we're cordial co-parents. My daughter is 2 now, healthy and happy, with no memory of those early terrifying months. Sometimes I watch her sleep and remember finding Diane in the nursery with her at her breast. Remember the video footage of Diane lifting her from the crib in the dark. The fear never completely fades, but it's manageable now. I keep the cameras running, I keep the locks changed, I keep my daughter safe, and that's enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.